Hey there, I'm Tatiana Mejia, passionate traveler and about cooking, and I found a way to blend my two greatest loves by creating the first gastronomic tourism agency in Latin America. Welcome to Bites and Sides, where we travel by eating and eat by traveling. In this space, I'll take you on a journey to discover gastronomic tourism, a one of a kind way to explore the world through its flavors, traditions, and local communities. When we talk about food and gastronomy, we often think about recipes, ingredients, or traditional dishes, but there is much deeper dimension that is rarely explored, the knowledge that exists behind every food we eat. Knowledge that has not always written in books or taught in universities, but passed down through observation, experience, and conservation shared around the earth. And this is precisely one of the reasons why food tourism can become a powerful tool for responsible tourism. Because when we travel to discover the foods of a region, we also have the opportunity to meet the people who have dedicated their lives to preserving the knowledge that makes those foods possible. Behind an ancestral seed, a medicinal plant, a traditional beverage, or an inherited recipe, there are generations of men and women who have protected knowledge that is essential to the cultural identity of their communities. And when we travel with respect, valuing the knowledge and understanding the connection between nature, food, and people, we help keep the heritage alive. That is why this episode matters, because it invites us to recognize those quiet guardians who often, from every and unseen spaces, have helped preserve an essential part of our food memory. For centuries across different regions of Latin America, knowledge related to medicinal plants, traditional crops, and food rituals has helped communities understand their environment and build a respectful relationship with nature. And in many cases, it has been women, grandmothers, traditional midwives, farmers, traditional cooks, and knowledge keepers who have played a fundamental role in preserving and passing on this wisdom. Long before pharmaceutical laboratories existed, people were already preparing herbal infusions to ease discomfort, pulse to heal wounds, and traditional beverage that accompanied community and ceremonial practices. Long before seed banks existed, families were already selecting and protecting crop varieties adapted to their territories. And long before anyone spoke about food heritage, women were already teaching others who how to recognize plants, respect growing cycles, and understand the cultural meaning of food. This knowledge did not emerge by chance. It is the result of centuries of observation, experience, and daily practice. It is knowledge built collectively and redefined over generations. It is also important to understand that traditional crops represent much more than a source of food. A native seed contains information about climate, biodiversity, and the history of a place. When a community preserves an ancestral variety of corn, potato, beans, or cassava, it is not simply protecting an ingredient, it is protecting part of its cultural heritage. And here's a fundamental question arises. What happens when this knowledge is no longer passed on? According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, approximately 70% of the world crop genetic diversity have been lost over the last century due to the replacement of local varieties with more uniform agricultural systems. Can you believe it? That's a huge percent. When a seed disappears, it is not only a plant variety that is lost, part of the knowledge connected to it disappear as well. Its cultivation methods, its medicinal uses, and its cultural significance. The same happens with food rituals. Many communities still maintain practices that connect food with important moments in life: births, harvests, celebrations, farewells, and expressions of gratitude to the earth. These riddles remind us that eating has never been only a biological act. Eating is also a way of building identity, belonging, and collective memory. In a time when speed seems to dominate our decisions, looking back at this ancestral wisdom helps us understand that there are other ways of relating to food, ways that are more conscious, more connected to natural cycles, and more respectful of the knowledge accumulated over time. And this is where we find an important lessons for those of us who believe in more responsible tourism. Because getting to know a place should not be only about consuming experiences. It should also mean understanding, valuing, and helping preserve what makes the place unique. So, in this episode, we are not going to talk about food. We are going to talk about the women who have helped preserve the stories carried by seeds, the wisdom found in traditional remedies, and the meanings hidden within rituals that have accompanied communities for centuries. Because understanding this knowledge also means recognize the people who have kept it alive. And very often, those people have been the true guardians of ancestral flavors. There is something that happens to me quite often when I travel throughout Latin America. I arrive in a community hoping to learn about a traditional recipe, and I end up discovering something much deeper. What begins as a conversation about food often turns into a conversation about medicine, agriculture, spirituality, history, and also memory. And I believe that is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about food tourism, because behind every dish there is an entire universe of knowledge that often goes unnoticed. And there is something I have discovered over and over again during these journeys. When you begin to follow the trail of the knowledge, you keep finding the same kinds of people in different places. A grandmother teaching others how to recognize a medicinal plant. A farmer preserving seeds inherited from her family. A traditional cook preparing recipes linked to a specific celebration. A traditional midwife who understands the food that accompany important moments in life. Even though the territories change, one thing remains constantly. Many of the people who have preserved this knowledge have been women. Women who rarely appear in history books, yet have played a fundamental role in protecting knowledge related to food, health, agricultural, and community life. That is why I wanted to dedicate this episode to them, to those quiet guardians who, from gardens, kitchens, earth, and spaces of care, have helped keep an essential part of Latin America's cultural heritage alive. When we think about ancestral knowledge, we often imagine all recipes passed down from one generation to the next. But this wisdom goes far beyond recipes. And when we talk about women's ancestral knowledge, we are not talking about cooking. We are talking about ways of understanding nature, ways of reading the cycle of the earth, ways of growing food, preparing remedies, preserving seeds, and using food as a form of care. For centuries, this knowledge has been shared in every space where women have often served as teachers, caregivers, and keepers of experiences. Several years ago, during one of my journeys through the Andes, I remember sharing a conversation with a woman who was preparing an herbal infusion before lunch. As she carefully placed leaves into a clay pot, she explained that this drink was much more than a hot beverage. It was something that helped the body receive food more comfortably and supported digestion. What's fascinating me was that she didn't speak about dosages, chemical compounds, or scientific studies. She spoke about observation. She told me her mother had taught her, and her grandmother had learned the same thing many years before. As I listened, I realized that this conversation was not only about a plant, it was also about a chain of women who had helped keep the knowledge alive across generations. That conservation made me think about something we rarely acknowledge. A large part of human knowledge was built through observation. Long before laboratories existed, people were already studying how the body responds to different plants. Long before agricultural research centers, farmers were already identifying which seeds could survive drought, adapt to certain climates, or produce better harvests. And that is where we find one of the greatest values of ancestral knowledge. It's not improvised knowledge. It is knowledge built over time through experiences, observation, and daily practice. For example, in Peru, there is a plant called muña, traditionally used by Andean communities to help relieve digestive discomfort and reduce some of the effects associated with high altitude. When you visit markets in Cusco or at the Sacred Valley, it is easy to find bundles of fresh muña. What is fascinating is that local communities learn when to harvest it, how to dry it, and how to prepare it long before modern research began studying its properties. Something similar happened in Mexico with epazote. Many families still use it in bean dishes because it is as traditionally been believed to support digestion. And in Colombia, plants such as hidrón, yerbabuena, toronjil, and limoncillo continue to play an important role in family kitchens. If there is one thing I have learned during my travels is that this knowledge is often discovered in the smallest details. I remember arriving in Peru Sacred Valley after several hours on the road. The altitude was beginning to make me itself felt. Before anyone even asked how I was doing, a woman smiled and said, "First, drink this." She handed me a cup of freshly prepared muña tea. The leaves has been harvested that very morning. What struck me was the simplicity of the preparation. There were no complicated formulas or no sophisticated tools, just hot water and fresh leaves. And yet, that small cup told me much larger story about hospitality, care, and practical knowledge accumulated over generations. Something similar happens in many rural homes throughout Colombia. After a large meal, it is still common to offer an herbal infusion made with citron, limoncillo, or hierbabuena. More than a beverage, these infusions are part of a daily tradition that continues accompanying family conversations and gatherings around the table. What is interesting is that many of these plants do not live only in the memories of older generations. They continue to grow in backyards, family gardens, and small farms across Latin America. In fact, many rural communities have what could be described as a living pharmacy. Not a pharmacy as we know it today, but a space where every plant has a place to live. I remember visiting a farm in Boyacá, Colombia, where the owner of the garden could point to one plant after another, explaining what each one has used for. For example, hierbabuena for digestive discomfort, toronjil for restless nights, calendula for homemade healing ointments, rosemary to flavor food and support traditional wellness practices. As I listened to her, I thought about something we rarely recognize. In many places, much of this knowledge has survived thanks to women who never wrote a book, never led a scientific study, and never appeared in the media. Women who learned by observing and thought by doing. Women who know the right moment to harvest the plant, prepare an infusion, or care for a common illness. And although many of these women remain anonymous, some have helped bring visibility to the importance of this knowledge. One example is Rosmilda Quiñones, a traditional midwife from Colombia's Pacific coast and founder of the Association of United Midwives of the Pacific. For decades, she has worked to preserve knowledge related to women's care, medicinal plants, and community health. Her story reminds us that his wisdom does not belong only to the past. It continues to play an important role in the lives of many communities today. During my travels through Tumaco on Colombia's Pacific coast, I encountered that same connection between food, care, and ancestral knowledge. I had the opportunity to spend time with Afro-descended women, many of them traditional midwives and knowledge keepers, who show me how medicinal plants remained an important part of daily life in their communities. Listening to them helped me understand something important. Often a plant is valued not only for its properties, it is also valued for the stories, experiences, and knowledge that surround it. Knowledge does not live only in a leaf or a root. It also lives in the people who know when to use it, how to prepare it, and when to share it. But I want to pause here for a moment. This is not about romanticizing ancestral knowledge or suggesting that it replaced modern medicine. No, it's not. It is about recognizing that it represents centuries of accumulated experience and form an important part of the cultural heritage of many communities. In fact, the World Health Organization has recognized the importance of traditional medicine systems in many regions of the world. Millions of people continue to rely on inherited knowledge as part of their everyday healthcare practice. That is why I often say that the earth has been one of humanity's greatest universities because around the fire, people were not only preparing food, they were sharing knowledge. I remember a conversation in Tumaco with an Afro descended woman who cared for a small medicinal garden beside her home. As she showed me the plants, she said something I have never forgotten. Nature is always speaking. We just have to learn how to listen. At the same time, that phrase surprised me. But as I listened, I realized that for many communities, learning is not only about receiving information, it is also about developing the ability to observe, interpret, and respect the cycles of natures. Perhaps one of the places where this transmission of knowledge is most visible is the Amazon in Colombia. There, much of the wisdom continues to be shared through storytelling, observation, and lived experience. When you speak with indigenous families, you quickly discover that plants are rarely understood in isolation. They are part of broader systems of knowledge where food, health, spirituality, and daily life are deeply interconnected. Yahe is one example. Many people have heard about Yahe ceremonies, but few understand that tremendous amount of knowledge involved in preparing this ancestral Amazonian plant medicine. The selection of the plants, the cooking process, and the dietary recommendation that accompany the ceremony are all part of knowledge systems developed over centuries. Depending on the tradition, the preparation can require many hours or even days of work. Some communities recommend avoiding certain foods before participating in a ceremony because food is considered an important part of the process. In other words, food and rituals are not separated, they complement one another. During my travels through Amazonian territories, I also heard stories about women who possess deep knowledge of the plants used in infusions, medicinal baths, and traditional preparations. Although attention is often focused on titans or spiritual leaders, many women play vital role in preserving knowledge related to health, family care, and the everyday use of medicinal plants. Something similar can be seen with mambiar, a traditional preparation made from coca leaves and processed according to ancestral knowledge preserved by several indigenous communities in Colombia. Although mambe or mambiar is often associated with the Amazon, it is also part of the cultural practices of some indigenous people in Colombian Caribbean region. What is interesting is that its use varies from one community to another. In some communities, both men and women participate in this space of conversation and learning. In others, a specific cultural tradition determined who may participate. Beyond those differences, Mambiar is often represented in gatherings where stories are shared, collective decisions are made, and teachings about life and territories are passed on from generation to the next. And when we talk about knowledge that has been passed down through generations, we inevitably have to talk about seeds because few things represents the continuity of a culture more powerfully than an ancestral seed. Because, for example, think about a potato. It may seem like a simple food, right? But behind it lies an extraordinary story. The Andes are considered the primary center of origin of a potato, and researchers estimated that its domestication began around 8,000 years ago. Yeah, 8,000 years. Can you believe it? That means thousands of people took part in it in selecting, adapting, and preserving different varieties over time. Today, more than 4,000 potatoes varieties have been documented throughout the Andean region. Each one has its own unique characteristics. Some are better adapted to temperatures, others thrive in specific types of soil. Some stand out because of their colors, textures, or flavors, and behind every variety lies generations of agricultural knowledge. One of the most remarkable places to understand this reality is the potato park located near Pisac in Cusco, Peru. There, Quechua communities have worked for years to preserve more than 1,300 varieties of native potatoes. The first time you heard that number, it can be surprising. Yeah, most of us are used to seeing only a handful of potatoes variety in grocery stores, right? But for these communities, every potato has its own story, purpose, and role within local farming system. During conversations with women farmers in the region, something deeply moved me. They don't speak about seeds as agriculture inputs. They spoke about them as if they were members of the family. They knew which varieties could withstand certain rains, which perform best in particular soils, and which needed to be shared with neighboring families to prevent them from disappearing. And that is when I understood something important. It's also in hands of women farmers who season after season carefully selected, classify, and exchange seeds to ensure their survival. These are women who often work for far from the spotlight, yet they played an essential role in biodiversity and food security. In different regions of Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, community seeds exchange are still held today. Women farmers, knowledge keepers, and rural families actively participate in these gatherings, and what circulates there is not only seeds. Experiences circulate, cultivation techniques circulate, knowledge about each varieties circulates, and here is the fact that should make us pause and reflect. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, approximately 75% of the world's agriculture genetic diversity has been lost over the last century. In other words, we are becoming increasingly dependent on fewer species and fewer varieties of crops. And that represents a major challenge for the future of food security. That is why preserving ancestral seeds is not only a cultural issue, it is also a strategy for protecting biodiversity, strengthening food sovereignty, and increasing resilience in the face of climate change. While preparing this episode, I remember a story I heard from a farming community in southern Colombia. A woman told me that every year She saved part of her harvest as seed for the next planting season. What I when I asked why she did not simply buy commercial seeds, she answered with a phrase I have never forgotten. Because these seeds already know this land. It may sound simple, yeah, but it carries tremendous wisdom because it reminds us that it reminds us a lot of things. It reminds us that agricultural is not only about producing food, it is also about understanding cycles, respecting timing, and maintaining a long term relationship with what we grow. That story also remind me a book I highly recommend, The Civilization of Corn by Mexican anthropologist Arturo Warman. It is fascinating work because shows how a single crop can become the foundation of an entire civilization. And speaking of corn, it is impossible to ignore one of the most extraordinary agricultural systems in the Americas, the Mexican milpa. A milpa is not simply a crop field. It is a way of understanding agriculture. Traditional corn, beans, and squash are grown together in the same space. Each plant plays a specific role. The corn provides support for the beans to climb. The beans help enrich the soil with nutrients. The squash helps retain moisture and suppress weeds. What we see here is a lesson in ecological cooperation that was developed long before modern concepts of sustainable agricultural existed. But the story of corn does not end in the field. It continues in the kitchen. It continues in a beverage. It continues in the techniques that transform a seemingly simple grain into one of the most important foods on the continent. And when we talk about corn, we are also talking about one of the most fascinating forms of knowledge development by the peoples of Latin America, food transformation. Because growing food is not all, it's only the first step. What comes next is equally important, knowing what to do with what the land provides. To talk about corn is to talk about tortillas, tamales, humitas, arepas, envueltos, mazamorra, anatole. It is to talk about hundreds of preparations that emerge because people observed, experimented, and redefined culinary techniques over generations. One of the most extraordinary examples is nixtamalization, a process developed by the peoples of Mesoamerica thousand years ago. It involves cooking corn with water and lime before grinding it. For centuries, communities practiced these techniques because it worked. Today, we know that nixtamalization improves the ability of certain nutrients and significantly change the characteristics of the grain. What is fascinating is that this knowledge existed long before modern science could explain its benefits. And behind many of these techniques, we find once again the same figures that have appeared throughout this episode: women who cook, women who observe, women who experiment, women who adjust, women who teach. Because for centuries, kitchens were also spaces of innovation, not innovation inside laboratories, but everyday innovation, the kind that happens when someone discovers a better way to preserve food, prepare a beverage, or make the most of a harvest. And that is where we find another great treasure of ancestral knowledge. In the techniques, in the process, in everything that happens before food reaches the table. And when we talk about food transformation, we also talk about fermentation. Long before refrigerators or modern laboratories existed, many communities had already learned how to use natural process to transform ingredients, preserve food for longer periods, and create entirely new preparations. Chicha is perhaps one of the best known examples. Found throughout Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, this traditional fermented beverage has accompanied celebrations, harvest, and community gatherings for centuries. Depending on the region, it may be prepared using different varieties of corn. Every family has its own methods. Every region contributes its own unique characters. And although today we often think of chicha simply as a traditional beverage, for a long time it was also a space for connection. What mattered was not only the final drink, it was everything that happened during the preparation, the conversation, the exchanges, the stories, the building of communities. During my travels throughout the Andes, I have heard stories from women who learned to prepare chicha by watching their mothers and grandmothers. Women who could identify the exact moment when a batch was all ready. Women who noticed subtle changes in the process that others might never recognize, and perhaps that reveals another form of knowledge that we don't always value enough: experience. Because some forms of knowledge cannot be learned simply by reading a recipe. They are learned through experience and through practice. Something similar happened with masato, a traditional fermented beverage made from cassava and prepared in different regions of Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. For many Amazonian communities, masato is much more than a drink. It is hospitality, it is welcome, it is sharing. I remember arriving at a community where the first thing I was offered was not an explanation about the territory or a formal introduction. It was a totuma filled with masato. And maybe you're thinking, what is a totuma? It is a bowl, or it is a bowl. It is made from a natural gourd, commonly used throughout many regions of Latin America. That simple gesture immediately communicated something important. You are welcome here. And that is one of the things I find most beautiful about food traditions. Sometimes a beverage carries a message that words do not need to explain. During my visits to Tumaco, I also learned about a traditional beverage from Colombia's Pacific coast called toma seca. The woman in the community explained that it has traditionally been used to support women's recovery after childbirth and to promote uterine health. Beyond its ingredients was what fascinated me, how this beverage reflects the connection between food, well-being, and ancestral knowledge that traditional midwives and women knowledge keepers have preserved for generations. And of course, another well-known beverage from Colombia's Pacific region soon entered the conversation: arrechon. Beyond the stories and popular beliefs that surround it, many people associated arrechon with fertility and often joke that anyone who drinks it might end up having a baby. Wherever, whether or not those beliefs are true is not really the point. What matters is understanding how traditional beverage become part of a community cultural imagination. They become part of shared stories, part of collective memory, part of the ways community explain and transmit knowledge. When we look closely at this traditional beverage, we realize that behind them there is much more than a recipe. There is agricultural knowledge, there is culinary knowledge, there is knowledge about fermentation, but there's also women who dedicated their lives decades have preserved techniques, timing, and preparations that continue to shape the identity of their communities. That is why, when we speak about the guardians of ancestral flavor, we must also think about the women who have protected ways of cooking, transforming, and sharing food, because food heritage does not survive only because ingredients exist. It survives because people know what to do with them. Perhaps that is why the work of researchers such as many that we have here in Colombia for years have traveled throughout Colombia documenting traditional culinary knowledge and helping bring visibility to many of the women who preserve ancestral ingredients, techniques, and preparations. That work has ensured that stories once known only within local communities have become part of broader conversations about food heritage and cultural diversity. And I find that extraordinary because it reminds us that ancestral knowledge is not only about the past, it also contains value lessons for the challenges we face today. While preparing this episode, I found myself listening once again to a song I love, La Raíz by Natalia Lafourcade, and I realized that few songs capture the essence of this conversation so beautifully because at its heart, this episode it's about our roots, about what connects us to the land, to the memory, and to those who came before us. And that connection is also reflected in food rituals because food has never been only a biological necessity. Food is also a symbol. Food is celebration. Food is memory. Food is identity. If we travel to Mexico during Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, we find tables filled with food prepared to honor loved ones who have passed away. Pan de muerto, tamales, chocolate, and other traditional foods became some symbolic bridges between generations. It is not only about eating, it is about remembering. But food rituals are not limited to remembering those who are gone. In many places, they are also accompanied moments of gratitude, celebration, and connection with nature. Something similar happened in many Andean communities where harvests are celebrated with specific foods and beverage that express gratitude to the earth. And when we speak about gratitude to the earth, it becomes impossible not to drink about not to drink, not to think about some of the traditions that continue to survive among indigenous people throughout Latin America. For example, in Colombia, Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, for example, the Arhuaco, Kogi, Wiwa, and Cancuamo peoples continue to practice ceremonies known as pagamentos. Although each community has its own way of carrying them out, the central idea is one of reciprocity with nature. What is interesting is that these rituals are not disconnected from food. After all, much of what reaches our tables depends on water, soil, seeds, and natural cycles. That is why in many agricultural cultures, a harvest was never seen simply as a productive result. It has also a reason to celebrate, a reason to give thanks. And if there is one food that beautifully illustrate the relationship between gastronomy, history, and ritual in Latin America, it's probably cocoa. Today, we often associate cocoa with chocolate, desserts, and industrial products, but for centuries it held a much deeper meaning for many Mesoamerican cultures. The Maya and later the Mexica considered it a food of great value. It was not consumed in the form of chocolate bars or candies as we know it today. Instead, it was primarily prepared as a beverage, mixed with water, spices, and other ingredients that vary according to the region and occasion. At certain moments in history, cocoa beans were even used as a form of currency. What is fascinating is that there are still communities in Mexico and Guatemala where cocoa continues to play an important role in collective gatherings, celebrations, and ceremonies. And once again, behind many of these preparations, we find women who understand fermented and drying process, women who roast the beans, women who prepare the beverage, women who continue to pass down techniques that form part of their community's identity. While researching this episode, I came across a beautiful reflection shared by Maya women involved in traditional cocoa practices. For them, preparing cocoa is not simply about making a drink, it is also about creating a space for conversation, gathering, and listening. And I believe few ideas capture the essence of this episode more clearly than that. Because food does not only nourishes the body, it also creates community. It also creates relationships. It creates meaning. Across many regions of Colombia, traditional foods connected to religious celebrations, family gatherings, and community festivals continue to survive. Some recipes appear only during a patron saint festival. Others are prepared to celebrate a harvest, and others accompany births, weddings, or farewells. And perhaps one of the most interesting examples of the relationship between food and care appears around childbirth. In different regions of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, broths, warm beverage, and herbal infusions traditionally prepared for the postpartum period are still part of local traditions. The ingredients vary from one territory to another, but the intention is often the same: to provide nourishing and comforting food that support a mother's recovery. And here's once again the guardians appear, the traditional midwives, women who for generations have accompanied some of the most important moments in community life. Beyond childbirth itself, many of them preserve knowledge related to medicine plant, nutritional, and traditional care practices. In Colombia, for example, Afro-descended midwives from the Pacific coast have been recognized for their role in preserving community health, knowledge, and family care traditions. One of them is Visitación Perea, widely respected for her work as a traditional midwife in Colombia's Pacific region. For many years, she has accompanied birth and cared for families in communities where this knowledge continues to be essential. Stories like hers remind us that the guardians of flavor do much more than preserve recipes. They preserve ways of caring, nurturing, and supporting life itself. What is remarkable is that many of these preparations rarely appear in restaurants or cookbooks. They remain in family kitchens, in notebooks passed down through generations, in the memories of those who continue preparing them, and perhaps there where and perhaps there we find one of the most important lessons of this episode. Often the most valued knowledge is not the most visible. It is the knowledge that remains alive because someone chooses to preserve it. These riddles also remind us something fundamental. Human beings do not eat only to survive. We also eat to create meaning. Perhaps that is why some of our most powerful memories are connected to a table, a recipe, or a person cooking for us, because food has the ability to connect emotion, stories, and places. And while preparing this episode, I realized something interesting. Throughout this journey, we have spoken about medicinal plants, seeds, beverage, crops, and riddles. But behind many of these forms of knowledge, the same figure appeared again and again. A grandmother teaching someone who how to recognize a plant, a farmer preserving a seed, a cook protecting a traditional recipe, a midwife accompanying life's most important moments. Perhaps that is why we choose to call this episode The Guardians of Ancestral Flavor. Because beyond the ingredients and techniques, there are women who have dedicated part of their lives to keeping knowledge alive, knowledge that today forms part of the cultural heritage of our communities. And perhaps that is where the true importance of ancestral knowledge lies, not only in the techniques, not only in the recipes, but in the way it helps us understand who we are, where we come from, and what kind of relationship we want to build with the food and with the world around us. And so we come to the end of this journey through women's ancestral knowledge, a journey that has taken us from medicinal plants still growing in family gardens to seeds that carry centuries of agricultural history, and throughout the beverage celebrations and food riddles that continue to give meaning to the lives of many communities. Today we discover that behind a cup of muña tea, a potato seed preserved for generations, a totuma of masato shared among friends, a serving of tomaseca prepared by women from Colombia's Pacific coast, or a special dish made for a celebration. There is much more than a recipe. There is a way of understanding the world. There is a relationship with nature. There is a collective memory built over time. But most importantly, we discover the true protagonists of this episode, the guardians of ancestral flavor, women who protected seeds long before anyone was talking about biodiversity, women who used medicinal plants when knowledge was still passed down primarily through oral traditions, women who preserve recipes, techniques, and riddles that today form part of the cultural identity of our communities. Women who taught their children's grandchildren and neighbors that food is not only a biological necessity, but also a way of preserving memory, strengthening relationships, and maintaining a connection to the land. And perhaps the greatest lesson these stories leave us is that ancestral knowledge does not survive on its own. It remains alive because someone chooses to practice it, share it, and pass it down. So, the next time you sit down at the family table, taste a recipe that has been handed down through generations, drink an herbal infusion prepared by a grandmother, or hear a story connected to food, I invite you to ask yourself, where did this knowledge come from? And who helped preserve it until today? Because very often the flavors that shape our identity exist thanks to the quiet work of women who dedicated their lives to protecting what they believe was value. And here I would also like to make a call to all of us involved in tourism, travelers, tour operators, institutions, governments, business leaders, and local communities. We need to continue building models of responsible tourism that value the people who preserve this knowledge and respect the natural rhythms of the places they call home. Tourism does not overwhelm destinations. Tourism that understands the cycle of nature. Tourism that supports local communities, tourism that recognizes that behind every food we enjoy, there is a chain of knowledge that deserves to be protected. Because food tourism, when developed consciously and responsibly, it is one of the most powerful forms of responsible travel. When we travel to understand a place through its flavors, we are not simply consuming a meal. We are connecting with the stories, with knowledge, with cultural landscapes. And when people have dedicated generations to preserving that heritage. And that is why I like to think that everything is connected. If we protect the seed, we protect the food. If we protect the food, we protect the recipe. If we protect the recipe, we protect the flavor. And if we protect the flavor, we preserve the story. If this episode made you reflect, I invite you to share it with others who enjoy discovering the stories behind food. You can also leave us a review on Spotify or your favorite platform and tell me about an ancestral practice, a family recipe, or a piece of inherited wisdom that is still alive in your home or community. I would love to hear your stories and continue building this space together, a place where gastronomy becomes a tool for understanding our territory and the people who inhabit them. You can find me on social media as Astuviaje Gourmet, or you can also visit my webpage, tatomejia.com, to learn more about our experiences, journeys, and projects related to food tourism. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Bites and Sides. I look forward to meeting you again in our next episode, where we will continue discovering stories, flavors, and territories that remind us that travel is also a way of learning, preserving, and connecting with the world through food. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next ones. Also, if you think this content can inspire other travelers or food lovers, please share and comment. It's an incredible way to help more people discover this conscious way of traveling. And with that, we close today's episode. Remember that every trip, every bite, it's an opportunity to connect more deeply with the world around us. So wherever you are, don't stop exploring, tasting, and discovering, because in the end, the best way to get to know a place is by eating it. See you in the next episode. Until then, keep traveling with an open palate and heart.